All right. I'm now joined by our producer Forrest, philosophy professor Ryan Lake, um, Daniel Bessner, who I think that if you watch this at this point, you know who that is, and Jacobin deputy editor Micah Uetricht to talk about Dr. Strangelove. And I should say that about midway through this, Daniel is going to have to slip out like a thief in the night to go to a department meeting online. But we'll soldier through when he's gone. And although while he's here, I should see. Do you want to come talk about a movie next week? What's your schedule?
Ben, for you, I'm always free.
Okay. All right. Well, we should go back to maybe we'll decide at the end of the stream what it is, but we should go back to the Scorsese series after this.
No, yes, we'll talk about it. Yeah.
I feel like maybe because of all like the GameStop shorting stuff, maybe Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great idea.
Nice. Let's do it. All right. So before we do the usual thing and sort of set it up by going through the plot of the movie, in this case, since Daniel is a historian who knows stuff that's relevant, has written about stuff even, thought that it might be interesting to start out with a little bit of historical background about the movie and what's being depicted in the movie.
Yeah, so this actually is basically the topic that I study in my day job, for which I'm leaving, which is essentially the history of the Cold War. So the Cold War is broken up into disparate periods, and basically this movie might be understood as the apotheosis, the cultural apotheosis of what is usually referred to as the early Cold War, which is between, most historians argue, 1947. With the passage of the National Security Act and really the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in March, where Truman essentially says the United States will fund, in relation to what's going on in Greece and Turkey, but he says the United States will essentially fund anti-totalitarian movements around the world. He actually uses the phrase totalitarian. And the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 62, which comes on the heels of what's called the Second Berlin Crisis, which is essentially two instances. In Berlin, U.S. and Soviet tanks faced each other, and in Cuba, of course, everyone knows that story, but basically missiles were placed in Cuba and the world came to the brink of nuclear annihilation. It's after that moment that the Cold War essentially cools down, I would argue, for the remainder of the Cold War's history. There's never really another real risk of nuclear war. There's mistakes like in '83 with Able Archer and things like that, but there's no like conscious policy making. We're going to go head to head and fight the Cold War, and the Cold War essentially ends in Europe and moves to what was then called the Third World and what is that now called the Global South. So that's a basic way of thinking about it. And Strangelove is really made during this sort of final moments of this early Cold War period, and it reflects the anxieties of that period, particularly over a nuclear war in the United States. And what would happen if an actual nuclear war breaks out. But the thing that I just want to emphasize is that the 1950s is really the golden era of nuclear strategy. There's a famous book called The Wizards of Armageddon by Fred Kaplan, and he basically goes through where these strategies are developed, and they're mostly developed at this think tank in Santa Monica called the Rand Corporation. Right? And if you remember in the movie, Strangelove receives a report from the Bland Corporation. And in researching for the movie, people get it wrong. They usually say something along the lines of Kubrick based Strangelove on Kissinger. That's wrong. Kissinger was a little famous in '57 with his in 1957, he releases his book, Foreign Policy and Nuclear Strategy, or forget the exact name, but that's basically it. But really, Strangelove is based on a series of German exiles and also Jewish intellectuals at the Rand Corporation, right? So there's something ironic here because Kubrick, who was himself Jewish, makes Dr. Strangelove into a Nazi. He, of course, Sieg Heils, and he like does the jackboot steps. But in actual historical fact, Strangelove was more likely to be an ex-socialist living in the United States. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And then also to emphasize that, like, he's really playing with these sorts of ideas of nuclear strategy and wise foreign policy making, because what distinguishes American foreign policy after the Cold War, what is really new, is that intellectuals are brought into the state. People like Dr. Strangelove are brought into the state in a permanent way, in a manner that they never had been before. So the 1950s is the era of the intellectual, the era of the egghead. So these things that Kubrick is satirizing, I just wanted to emphasize it's profoundly historical. It emerges from a very peculiar historical moment that I think that is important to understand in order to understand what is going on with the movie. And you see it, and then I'll stop here, but you see it with sort of the tensions between Strangelove and the military, right? Because these people are making different appeals to expertise. The military, of course, claims it knows how to fight a war, and then Strangelove's response, and Strangelove was actually based on this big gentleman named Herman Kahn, who was a very influential RAND strategist. And Kahn had a famous line when a general once challenged him. He goes, "General, how many nuclear wars have you fought?" Right? So this provides a space for intellectuals to assert their authority. And in my mind, this is the precursor to people like Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Francis Fukuyama, all of these intellectuals having an enormous influence on U.S. foreign policy based on the fact that we've never fought a nuclear war. So they're able to enter the state through this thing. And all of these tensions, I think, are expressed profoundly in the film. So I just want to
and adding a little bit of context to that on a more specific note to the movie, Kubrick became really obsessed after, like, around the Cuban Missile Crisis with the idea of, like, thermonuclear war as a concept. And so he was reading a lot of Kahn. He was reading on thermonuclear dynamics. Like, he was really getting into all of this, and he understood very deeply, because of how much he was reading at the time, like the intricacies of this policy.
Danny, I was going to say, you didn't really stick the landing of that opening lecture, because you should have ended with commercials for both of your books.
Yeah, I write about this. Yeah. So if you want to read that, buy my book.
Yeah. Which is?
Yeah, come on, let's go.
I don't believe anyone's going to buy it, but it's called Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. And I was thinking of calling it like the real Dr. Strangelove or something. So it's based on these types of figures.
Nice. All right. So these are the defense intellectuals from the title of Daniel's book, and so that's one thing that the movie is very much about. I mean, I also think, like, before we start getting into specifics, another thing that it's very much about is just the the military as an institution. That, like, yeah, I think it's at the beginning of the movie. They even have a little thing on the screen saying that, like, the Defense Department has assured us that that protocols already in place, would stop anything like this from happening, which of course is a cheeky little thing to throw in, because any remotely normal human being will have the opposite reaction to that from feeling reassured by it. And one of the funniest lines in the movie, is that the president, who I guess is like he feels like a little bit like he's supposed to be a Truman kind of figure.
He's Adlai Stevenson. That's
okay.
That's who Peter Sellers based the character off of.
Okay, so who was the Democratic candidate against Eisenhower?
Mm-hmm. I just started listening to Nixon Land, and just got past that part as we were getting ready to watch this, and then I saw the documentary, like the making of Dr. Strangelove, talking about that, and I was like, wow, these things are intersecting right now.
Yeah. So the president says, General, when you instituted the Human Reliability Protocol, you assured me that nothing like this could ever happen. And he says, well, I wouldn't condemn a whole system because of a single slip up, which is obviously gets to the the apocalyptic stakes of all this. And I think Daniel sort of referred in passing to one of the near miss incidents that had happened, well after this, but there were several, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was which, I mean, was one giant near miss, but there was a more specific near miss, I think involving like a Russian submarine that actually had nuclear missiles on it, but was being bombarded. If I'm getting this right, and there was a discussion among the officers on the ship about whether we're to return fire and basically start World War III, and like more level heads prevailed, but it was a near thing. And I know that there was also an incident in the 1980s actually, where the Russian like missile detection system, like registered that there were American nuclear missiles coming in, and what they were supposed to do, right? What they is to, like, the guy who was manning this, as the officer in charge, was supposed to report this up the line, and then this would trigger the response, which would have been World War III, and he didn't do it because he made the very reasonable calculation that it was probably just something going haywire with the system, because what are the chances that the Americans would only send one missile? But of course, if he'd done his job as he was supposed to do it, then that could have been that.
One thing, Ben, I think that's important to emphasize is that people often mistake how a nuclear war would happen. People talk about the nuclear football, but in actuality, there's like, I want to say hundreds, but at least a dozen or so decision points around the world where like people way below the president or the premier in the Soviet Union are like actually able to initiate a nuclear war. So it's super fucking frightening, actually. Like, command and control structures are really important and really frightening. We don't think about them enough. And I would point people to Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, which is actually a really good explanation of like all of these decision points. So it's not just like someone carrying a football in the White House. Throughout the world, lower-level military officials, who I would add are neither elected nor even really appointed, are able to like start a nuclear war. So these are really serious issues that like we haven't talked about in a long time on the left, but it's important to take account of.
Was the Doomsday device in Dr. Strangelove named after that, or was it?
That's from Tom's book. I think it's on Film or Nuclear War. Where he basically goes through a series of thought experiments, and then one of them is the Doomsday device. Like that, guaranteed. It's guaranteed because there's no decision, right? So the question, and then I'll shut up. But the question of nuclear war is who gets to decide to go to nuclear war, right? So what people in the 50s were trying to do was trying to remove the human element of it, because that would make it as rational as possible, right? If no one decides, then that's the most rational thing, because humans are subject to emotion. Right. And this is like it's ridiculous because the algorithm is a human choice ultimately, just like the Doomsday Machine is a human choice ultimately. But this is what he's parodying with people like Strangelove, and why Kubrick interviewed Khan.
And it's a really strange thing, because I mean, obviously, even by 1964, this was pretty this was very much a dead letter. But theoretically, only Congress is supposed to be able to declare war. And so it's a strange thing that even like, okay, the most significant kind of war that could possibly happen, would be something that would be a unilateral, presidential decision. Never mind that you would set up that these like emergency, bypass things where, just in case the president is incapacitated or something, we have to make sure that somebody else somewhere is in a position to end the world.
Well, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I mean, the idea of like deterrence is that, you're never going to have to use them in their minds. You know what I mean? Like the thing is that they're going to scare people shitless, scare the Russians shitless out of ever detonating their device, because then our device would go off. So kind of having all these contingency plans are not things that they're really ever planning to happen, which is what they're kind of parodying in Dr. Strangelove, which is how easily it could happen, if somebody chose to, or if somebody broke and became psychotic.
I think that yes and no. I think there's an element of thought that I think you're right. I think there's a strong element of thought, maybe even the dominant one. But there's also, people forget this, but there was like all this civil defense obsession in the 50s, right? Whenever you see a fallout shelter. So Herman Kahn in that book is writing about like how many millions of Americans will need to be put in giant caves in order to ensure that society will continue, right? This is like the era. Historians refer to the 50s as the age of anxiety, right? Because everyone's fucking freaked out about nuclear war. They just fought 2 gigantic world wars. And so people really think it's going to happen. So you have these like crazy schemes, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars spent on these civil defense projects. And so whenever you see a fallout shelter, you know, asbestos lined fallout shelter, it comes from that sort of money.
Yeah. And it is, right. And I mean, I think this, you know, this is not exactly an original insight, but I mean, I think that, that it does tell you something about, you know, people like I think it's an important part of the trajectory of a lot of people who end up, you know, becoming, you know, new leftists, and, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, who became, you know, militant anti-war activists, that they, you know, that their childhoods happened in a period where this kind of brinksmanship was going on, where, you know, where you literally have, you know, nuclear war drills and, you know, in schools, you know, to learn to duck under the desk, you know, to stop yourself from being irradiated. So, you know, it's something that, you know, I mean, the same way that like whatever people are doing in 15 years, a big part of the explanation is that part of their childhood happened, you know, while they were locked inside because of a plague, you know, that this is something that I think you definitely have to take into account there. But let's get into the plot of the movie. So I think actually the Wikipedia summary is pretty good. So let's just start there. The United States Air Force Brigadier General Jack D. Ripper, which is just an awesome name.
Very, very subtle.
yeah. I don't get it. Is commander of the Burleson Air Force Base, which houses the 843rd Bomb Wing, flying B-52 bombers armed with hydrogen bombs. The planes are now on airborne alert, 2 hours from their targets inside the USSR. So the idea, what's portrayed here at the beginning of the movie, is that they sort of fly, you know, very close, you know, every day or however long they, you know, often they do this to Soviet territory, and then they kind of automatically, you know, it's just a routine thing, you know, that they get their orders, which are always to turn back. Because, you know, World War III hasn't started. General Ripper orders his executive officer, Group Captain Lionel Mandrake of the UK Air Force, who's there, said there's some sort of officer exchange program, to put the base on alert and to issue Wing Attack Plan R to the patrolling bombers, one of which is commanded by Major T.J. King Gong, which is also very subtle.
I mean, it's worth mentioning. This thing is full of like not subtle, like the names of the characters, and also just like tons of innuendo. I mean, the other character Turgensen. I mean, and you know, Merkin Muffley is the president. I mean, like you have these hyper masculine characters. I think this has to be an intentional theme. Like all the insane characters, like the connection between masculinity and militarism, and then the only two like kind of voices of reason are these pretty effeminate guys, right? The Muffley and Mandrake, the much less hyper masculine characters, the only ones trying to avert the war. The rest are just all gung ho. They're ready to go for it.
And there's definitely something to point out, and I think Daniel's talked about this at length on this show too. Like the fact that, you know, at the end of World War II, we're like U.S. is the dominant power. So Peter Sellers, like Mandrake character, is very servile throughout the entire thing. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
As much as he's like the executive officer, like that kind of seems like more of a secretary than anything. Like he's getting him drinks, he's kind of, you know, pouring him his like daily stuff. He's like holding the you know, like he's holding the strap as he, like, you know what I mean, as he shoots. Like it's like he's almost like a servant, you know, like behind the U.S. in Empire.
He fetches the rainwater and grain alcohol for him.
Yeah. And enough times that he has to know, because he says, hey, did you ever wonder why I only drink, you know, rainwater and grain alcohol? Like he has to have gotten it enough times that that's like a regular question he could be asking.
Yeah. And the answer, of course, not to jump ahead too much, is that he's very concerned about the corruption of his precious bodily fluids by the fluoridation
Which is a real John Birch Society conspiracy theory from the time.
You know, Ben, when we bring this up, we have to mention, have you ever visited the statue in Grand Rapids, Michigan to fluoridation?
No,
if there's a statue in Grand Rapids to fluoridation,
I don't think I've ever visited it, but I remember it being discussed, and I think there was a dentist from Grand Rapids who was like the original fluoride guy. So Ben and I have a tie to the origins of fluoridation of water.
Oh wow, I do too. I'm over in Muskegon right now. I'll have to pop over and check that out.
Actually,
oh, you're in the hometown.
Yeah.
Micah and Ryan are both Muskegonites. Actually, funnily enough.
That's right.
Yes. Grand Rapids was the first city to fluoridate its water.
Nice. Go Grand Rapids. That's awesome.
There was the celebration of it literally almost a year ago to the day of their, I think, the 75th anniversary.
That's amazing.
The first group of commies to ever think of precious bodily fluid.
That's right. That explains why Muskegon produces commies.
Yeah.
I mean, people still are paranoid about the fluoridation thing, but at the time there was like a John Birch Society specific conspiracy theory that the communists were trying to steal. I mean, to get us to be manipulated by fluoride, pretty much.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a little echo. I mean, and this was fairly, as conspiracy theories go. I mean, the Birchers, were important enough that like that's part of the case for like William F. Buckley is the allegedly reasonable conservative that he drew the line and like a sort of proto never Trumper and expelled the John Birchers from the mainstream of the conservative movement. Which actually I think the fact that was treated as quite such a big deal is maybe an indication of just how widespread this is. I don't know that like that a Buckley equivalent now would get quite that many points for saying that like QAnon was wrong. But all right. All of the aircraft commenced an attack flight on the USSR and set their radios to allow communication only through their CRM-114 discriminators, which are designed to accept only communications preceded by a secret 3-letter code only known to General Ripper. Mandrake discovers that no attack order has been issued by the Pentagon and tries to stop Ripper, who locks them both in his office. Ripper tells Mandrake that he believes the Soviets have been fluoridating American water supply to pollute the precious bodily fluid of Americans. Mandrake realizes that Ripper has gone insane. And yes, this is why, which is funny actually that he insists on the, I understand the rainwater to avoid the fluoridation. I'm not sure I understand the grain alcohol, especially because he also says that you notice that commies never drink water. They only drink vodka, because they want to avoid the fluoridation themselves. So you'd think that he could drink vodka or something, and that would be fine.
Right.
Well, vodka is a communist drink. Clearly.
Yeah, he's not a damn commie. Come on.
Grain alcohol, 100% American. Celebration of freedom when you're drinking grain alcohol.
That's right.
Yeah, and this, which I suppose makes sense, because it's like there's a discussion later in the movie with the Russian ambassador about smoking Cuban versus Jamaican cigars. That each side is very adamant about not doing the other one.
Well, maybe it also could be like Trump's thing about if you inject bleach, you can kill COVID. Like maybe he drinks grain alcohol because he thinks it's strong enough stuff to kill the fluoridation that you've accidentally ingested.
Fair enough.
The cigar exchange is great. Where he says, I do not like smoke cigars from imperialist stooges," and he's like, "Oh, only commie stooges, huh?"
Yeah. All right. The war room at the Pentagon, General Buck Turgidson briefly briefs President Merkin Muffley. This is, I should say on the subject of the names, like this is actually a little jarring because like for most of the movie, like most of the humor is not quite as goofy and over the top as the names are, so every time they say one of these names, it's like, wow, wait, really? About how Plan R enables a senior officer to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike on the Soviets, if all superiors have been killed in a first strike in the United States. It would take 2 days to try every CRM code to issue the recall order, but the planes are due to reach their targets within hours. Muffley orders the U.S. Army to storm the base and arrest General Ripper. And this is another one of these places, I should say, where you have like all of the stuff about the kind of insanity of the military as an institution, you know, in the movie, because there's a big exchange about basically whether the base, you know, whether like these people who are being ordered to you know invade the base to get Ripper are really able to take base security, or you know who would, you know, like which one of them is stronger and, you know, is going to be able to do it. And even with all this going on, you know, they're still very concerned about their bureaucratic turf, you know, which one is
who's got the bigger dick, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And we learned it's the Army.
Yeah, no, that's right. They kick their asses. So, you know, there you go.
That scene at the end where he's like, yes, but can we stop them? And he's like, when a pilot gets going, like really gets going, and he's like, gets really into it, and he's like, then looks around, realizing that means no, like they're not going to be able to stop him.
Yeah.
Swept up in his own fervor.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, how revved up he gets is so great. Another thing I read, maybe you've heard this, it's a bit of trivia, is as George C. Scott, who played Turgidson, apparently Kubrick had to trick him to give that over-the-top performance. So he wanted to do a more straight performance. And so Kubrick said, well, first just do a really ridiculous take. We won't use that one. And then you can do your straight take. But just to get warm up, do something ridiculous. And then he used all the ridiculous takes. I guess George C. Scott like walked out of the theater and just vowed never to work with Kubrick again because he was so upset that Kubrick used all the ridiculous takes. Yeah.
The film is full of just top-notch performances, but him in the you know, pointing at the big board, I mean, that's like one of the highlights of the movie.
He's so fantastic, but he did not want those takes to be the movie.
Kubrick is another example of like the Coppola thing we had the whole you know stream about with somebody that's so artistically genius that they kind of can get away with whatever the fuck they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, right. Like I remember when Eyes Wide Shut came out. They're reading this interview with Nicole Kidman about that movie where she was like responding to the idea that Stanley Kubrick was misogynist. Just like, I don't know, does Stanley hate women? I mean, does he? Is there anybody he doesn't hate? I mean, I guess, right? So.
He seems to make actors go literally insane. I mean, he does so many like literally act. I mean, I think that broke up Tom and Nicole. You know, I think that he was so demanding in take after take after take after take that people literally lose their minds, to the point where I think every single one of his movies, forgive me if I'm wrong, film historians, but almost every one of his movies like ran over time and ran over budget. I think Eyes Wide Shut was supposed to take like several months and it took over a year, something like that, you know, and I think that he just breaks performers down. And I don't think he was really able to do it quite as much in this movie because it was so much earlier in his career and Sellers was such a gigantic star. But it's interesting to think about like sort of the Kubrick and sort of breaking down these people and getting the type of performance is really interesting.
Well, it's less, I think, in this one that Kubrick was fucking with the actors and more. I was watching the documentary of like the making of where everybody was talking about it, like what the experience of making it was like. And there was a big he was fucking with the set design guy who was like a German British set designer that was like a really famous one because they were shooting it in England. And like the guy was really happy because the first time they designed the B-52 bomber, he's like, this is great. Or no, I think it was the War Room. He's like, this is great. I love this. And he's like, wow, like he actually isn't as hard to work with as everybody says. And then like 3 weeks later, he goes, we have to totally redesign this. I don't like the second floor. And makes the guy completely redesign his entire War Room thing.
Yeah. All right. So Turgidson then attempts to convince Muffley to let the attack continue, which again is a lot of the dark humor throughout the movie, or various people at various levels of the military who are convinced that you can somehow win this kind of war. But Muffley refuses. Instead, he And I should actually also say that on this, on this subject, Forrest was talking earlier about Rick Perlstein's, history books, Nixon Land, The Invisible Bridge, Before the Storm, and Reagan Land. And I've read almost all of those. I'm very, very slowly working through Reagan Land. It's a big book, but
I finished it on Saturday after, like, I don't know, 4 months of putting it off and reading it, or listening to it, then putting it off. And
yeah,
I'm awaiting the audiobook from my library to finally. I've read all 4. People should read Rick Perlstein if they haven't. There's nobody like him.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think those books are. I think those books are really valuable. The way that he traces the history of the culture wars, and Reagan Land right now. I mean, you could see a lot of the sort of culture war stuff that's going on right now in the 70s version. But I remember, I think it was Nixon Land. He spends a while talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the response. And I will say that whereas for the record, I do still think that almost certainly Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK, and that was that. I will say that having listened to that, I do give a little bit more credence than I ever used to all of the sort of I don't know, whatever deep state conspiracy ideas about who killed JFK, because it is insane how much a lot of the military establishment was like furious at Kennedy for backing off at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis and not starting World War III.
And also, of course, the Bay of Pigs not providing air support to the invading exiles. So it's like the 1-2 punch, I think. Yeah, no, that it's very interesting surrounding JFK. There's a lot of strange things. As a professional historian, I'm saying there's a lot of strange things surrounding that assassination. I don't think we'll ever know, but it's interesting. You just get a sense of the sort of conspiratorial thinking that was in the air as Kubrick is making this movie, right? It's really the end. It's not the beginning of something. It's capturing sort of a moment that's ending, which I think is also interesting when you're thinking about Strangelove as historical piece. Nuclear strategy would never quite be the center of talk ever again in the way that it was in the 50s and the early 60s. And I think he's capturing this moment that's really fading in a very interesting way. Yeah,
right. So and the air support thing is actually particularly crazy. Like the Chapo thing they did about Poppy Bush, like they captured this really nicely, like how crazy it is that all these guys, were furious about JFK for not providing air support in the Bay of Pigs, because they only got him to not nix the operation when he took over as president by convincing him that he would not actually have to do that. And then essentially what they got that mad at him for was the fact that they were unable to successfully trick him into doing this thing that they said he wouldn't have to do. Like how dare you not be like fooled into doing the thing you said you were absolutely unwilling to do. But then the Cuban Missile Crisis part is just totally insane. And I should say, I mean, that there is, we can, I think, do a little bit of accurate both sidesism in this case, because I think part of the reason that Khrushchev was forced out later, that was able to happen, was that a lot of people at the high levels of the Soviet establishment, thought that he'd lost face, in the confrontation with the Americans there. So I think all of this stuff about them, even on like the brink of Armageddon, like trying to convince the president to let it go forward and just let it happen, as hard as that is to take seriously, that actually seems to be like not even satire or exaggeration. That seems to be exactly what actually happened. All right. Turchison attempts to convince Muffley to let the attack continue, but Muffley refuses. Instead, he brings Soviet ambassador Alexei Sadetsky into the war room to telephone Soviet Premier Dmitry Kisov on the hotline. Which, again, but yes.
Yeah, the phone conversations between Muffley and the Soviet premier are just probably my favorite thing in the movie. They're just hilarious. And I think I read that Peter Sellers improvised a lot of that conversation, and it's just absolutely hilarious. It's just great.
A big amount of it is improvised. Kind of just like, let him do these long 10-minute takes on the phone and use whatever he wanted.
I love the lines from the president where he's like, well, Dimitri, I'm just as upset as you are. I mean, we're on the same side here. I mean, it's such a perfect encapsulation of these sort of weak-kneed Democrats who, even as they're literally about to drop a nuclear bomb on the Soviet Union, they're like, listen, we're on the same side. We're all this together. Like, you're about to blow the country to smithereens. Like, even though there's no conflict that must be admitted, even in that moment.
Well, there's also the competitiveness of it. He's like, don't say you're more sorry than me. I'm sorry too. Like, there's no seating ground to Russia, even in like
that's right. Yeah, like I like talking to you. I'm happy to call you.
We're friends.
Not right now, but yeah.
It's the perfect like Democrat brain.
Yeah.
Half a century ago.
Yeah, I mean the combination of the idea that he's calling to have a conversation that would be impossible under any circumstances. That we're about to accidentally nuke you. I'm so sorry. Let's leave it there. But it's happening at a time when Dmitry Kisov is I think he's supposed to be at his dacha, like very drunk late at night.
Yeah.
And then yes, the combination of that with the Adlai Stevenson stand-ins Democrat brain is just amazing.
I also love the line, the premier is a man of the people, but he's still a man.
That's right.
It's a pretty amazing depiction. I mean, I believe in watching the Adlai Stevenson president that he doesn't want to nuke the Soviet Union, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, as you just said, like JFK didn't really want to invade Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, but like the national security establishment sort of pushes these weak-kneed Democrats into carrying out this kind of stuff, and they just sort of go along for the ride and like imagine themselves as somehow above it and not as Luke Savage, Jacobin staff writer, recently pointed out. Like there's all the Democrats are always talking about how it's like somebody should do something about this. Like we don't have the power to do anything about it, but like somebody should. Like this is bad, and it's like no, you also hold the levers of power, and yet you are letting the right just steer the entire ship, and you're not doing anything about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the most extreme manifestation of that is now that all these people have Twitter. So they're literally always tweeting, somebody should do something about X, and it's like, yeah, but you're like the Speaker of the House. You're surely if there's anybody who's somebody, it's you.
Yeah, and that's a historical matter that really does get going with JFK, and then accelerates under Johnson, particularly in terms of the escalation in Vietnam in '64 and '65, because the idea is that the Democrats, particularly during the '60 campaign, are really worried about not looking strong on national security because of Eisenhower basically anointing Nixon, Eisenhower being the great general of World War II, and this is why you get the sort of the fake news of the missile gap that Kennedy really exacerbates during the campaign. So this is like the beginning of that sort of trend, and partially one of the reasons Kennedy felt to do that is because Stevenson was viewed as like a weak need. One in the 52 and 56 campaigns, that was a big criticism. Liberal internationalists cares about the UN, restricting American sovereignty. And you get that tradition that we're still living in right now really gets going with Kennedy in the 60 campaign about Democrats being very afraid of looking weak on national security and sort of overcompensating. And of course, I'm sure you guys know the Bay of Pigs was an Eisenhower plan. Right. And so one of the reasons that Kennedy did it is because the generals were like, this is an Eisenhower plan. You're going to go against Eisenhower, the great general who you served under. I mean, Kennedy was in the Navy, but whatever, who you and in the Pacific, but et cetera. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize from the moment.
It's also it's interesting after starting to read Nixonland. I mean, not to keep bringing it up, but I guess the privilege that a lot of these Democrats were born into, like Adlai Stevenson is obviously, he's from a long line of politicians. I mean, so is Kennedy in a way. I mean, so it's like, these almost like dynasties and these weak leaders that are thrust into these positions, but they're kind of, bred for these positions in a way.
Yeah, no, for sure. Building
off that very quickly, just because, especially because I got to go soon. what Forrest just said really makes me think of like Kennedy as Catholic, which makes me think of this movie as Jews, because Kubrick, of course, is Jewish, and Sellers found out that he was Jewish, right? So what you almost have here is sort of like newly whitened ethnic whites, basically reflecting on the WASP establishment that they're going into, right? And that's what Kubrick's doing. And it's not for nothing that Jews, at least in the United States, weren't really allowed in the State Department, even in the 40s and the 50s. So they had to enter spaces like Rand. They had to enter spaces as intellectuals in order to enter the elite of foreign policy making. So that's another tension that's going on here. You have sort of this outsider critic commenting on people like himself going into this establishment, which may be one of the reasons that Strangelove is a Nazi, again, and not this ex-socialist he was more likely to be in real life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess thinking about the sort of WASP born for leadership thing, I guess for both Democrats and Republicans in the time period, I think there's a mixture, right? Truman's definitely not, Stevenson definitely is. I guess Eisenhower, I'm actually not too sure about his background. Nixon, Nixon was I guess technically a WASP, but not what anybody means by that, right? He was raised by Quakers, who's obviously severely lapsed.
Yeah, and from a pretty poor background of an abusive kind of father. It's interesting.
I think like a sort of like struggling small shopkeeper kind of background. Yeah.
It's interesting. Both Nixon and Reagan kind of have these like somewhat abusive, alcoholic, like failure fathers that are always trying to build their careers up, and you know what I mean. So that bootstraps ideology that Republicans have, I know for them, I think it probably is like a real thing in their minds. You know what I mean? Because at the same time, someone like Adlai Stevenson or Kennedy, I mean, it's more of like, they're more centrist, but there's like a limousine liberal kind of attitude towards a lot of their policies, I think.
Yeah, and it is interesting also, in terms of what Daniel's talking about some of these people from like refugee Jewish backgrounds, coming into these coming into the defense establishment by this different road, stuff like Rand, because even though I'm not saying anything that I haven't learned from hearing you, but even though a lot of these people actually, like, earlier in their lives, they might have been, like socialists, and, in Germany, they had drawn these really kind of hardcore anti-populist conclusions from going through the Nazi experience, and which ties into what we're talking about, the idea that you want to avoid the human element as much as at all possible in this kind of decision making. Because it goes into this version of liberalism that's just like intensely technocratic, because it associates mass politics with fascism.
I think that's right. And it also explains the mid-century embrace of capitalism, because the dream of capitalism is that everyone would be able to interact freely in the market, right? It doesn't matter if you're a Jew. It doesn't matter if you're Black. It doesn't matter if you're white. The thing that matters is money, right? And so there are a lot of these strands that have been, and Ben, this, that were like sort of going around from the mid-19th century are really institutionalized only in the middle of the 20th century. And so there's a lot of sort of faith in abstract rationality as being the sole way to go. And you get it, famously with Daniel Bell's book, 1960 book, The End of Ideology, right? And then which is repeated later by Fukuyama in 89 with The End of History, right? So this becomes a totem for liberalism, the idea of sort of abstract rationality as the only way to govern legitimately, which of course for a million reasons is totally fucking wrong, but it's not surprising while in the mid-century, a lot of oppressed people would essentially come to this conclusion, given their own personal historical experience.
And a lot of what Dr. Strangelove is about is like just dark comedy mockery of the idea that you could have this sort of automated way of making these decisions, and that it would work out well.
This is also, it's been a couple of years since I've read it, but Greg Grandin's book on Henry Kissinger, he points out that Kissinger very much did not believe in this kind of like highly rationalistic way of doing foreign policy and waging war. I can't remember what how Grandin characterizes it, but he's not whoever the oh God, what's it from the Ford Corporation who was
McNamara.
McNamara. He's like the opposite of McNamara's way of waging war like a technocrat. Like he's going on gut feelings.
Yeah, right. And McNamara is the ultimate technocrat. I remember even after he he turned against, like he started to feel bad about those millions of people who died in Vietnam, because of him. He was still he was still arguing in like very late interviews that like overall though it kind of balanced out because he'd because of his like car safety innovations earlier in his career, probably saved as many people as he killed in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's like not everyone takes the approach that I did. I think people like Kissinger conclude from the Nazi experience that it's just about power, and power is ultimately irrational. So there's sort of the opposite conclusion that people can take. And then a bunch of people say, like people like Walt Rostow, who was a national security advisor in the I think Kennedy and LBJ administrations at different points. His claim is that what you need to do is just secularize and modernize the world, and there'll be no war. So there's a bunch of different responses to the sort of tragedy of the first half of the tragedies of the first half of the 20th century. Kubrick is focusing on one in particular.
Fair enough. All right. Muffley warns the premiere of the impending attack and offers to reveal the positions of the bombers and the targets. The Soviets can protect themselves, which of course horrifies the generals in the war room. After a heated discussion in Russian with the premier, the Bessner informs President Muffley the Soviet Union has created a Doomsday as a nuclear deterrent.
A Doomsday device.
Consists of many buried bombs jacketed with cobalt thorium G, which are detonated automatically should any nuclear attack strike the country. Within 2 months after detonation, the cobalt thorium G would encircle the planet in a radioactive shroud that would render the Earth's surface uninhabitable. The device cannot be deactivated as it is programmed to explode if any such attempt is made. Again, it's the automated procedures. The president's wheelchair-bound scientific advisor, former Nazi German Dr. Strangelove, points out that such a doomsday device could only be an effective deterrent if everyone knew about him. Alexei replies the Soviet premier will plan to reveal its existence at the party congress the next week, which is also one of the best lines in the movie. You know how he loves surprises.
It's the movie is obviously mostly skewering the United States, but there are some very funny skewerings of the Soviet Union in there throughout too. Stuff like that is just so good. It's just like you can see what the dysfunction of the Soviet system in its own way. It's
perfectly set up after he's drunk on the phone too. You know what I mean? Like he's like the party premier.
All right. Meanwhile, U.S. Army troops arrive at Burpleston. General Ripper commits suicide. So this is the thing, the discussion where Burpleson is asking the his servile, effeminate British commander under him, Mandrake, if he'd ever been tortured, and Mandrake says yes, and he describes his experiences with the being tortured by the Japanese army in World War II, and then of course what Mandrake thinks is going to result from all of this is that he'll be afraid of being tortured, so he'll just agree to give them the information right away. So he thinks he should play it up. But of course, this has the opposite effect from what he wants, because this gets Burpleson to kill himself in order to make sure that to make sure that that World War III goes ahead as planned. That this is, and again, this is actually all the Burpleson stuff, I should say, is another iteration of this. What the movie is exploring in terms of the decision-making procedures, because one of his more memorable lines in the movie is "War is too important to be left to politicians."
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I'll leave after this because I got to get ready for my next meeting. Which again is sort of this anti-democratic thing, right? This is like permeating the culture at the time. And it wasn't great for sort of democracy that it was Eisenhower who became president in the 50s, even though Eisenhower was actually more willing to sort of go against the military because he's like, I know these bozos and I know they don't know what they're talking about. But just the very fact that it's sort of military general, and we're seeing it now with the last two, not the last two, but a few of the last few SecDefs being military generals, right? And the fact that Biden appointed Austin and Mattis under Trump. I mean, this is a problem for democracy. But I will leave you all with that. Guys, enjoy the rest of the thing, and I'll see you soon.
Well, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, and actually, it is interesting. We were talking about the Stevenson Eisenhower, election earlier, and I should. I remember reading a while back Philip Roth's memoir of the facts, and I love Roth as a novelist. He's one of my favorite writers, but he is, like, all of his political pronouncements. He is kind of the ultimate lib. Since he has this thing where every new Republican president, you read what Roth wrote about him at the time. It's always that he's this totally unprecedented evil that's completely different from previous Republicans, and so. He's always like very funny and effective about it, right? He wrote kind of a comic novel about Nixon. He has this like great rant about Trump, but it is funny because he always claims that like they're different, from the old Republicans. But if you read that memoir of the facts, since that came out in like the 60s sometime, I think he in there. He goes on and on and on about how much he hated Eisenhower and like his reaction to that Eisenhower-Stevenson election is like, I mean, it's like the sort of reaction that, liberals had to, to Bush-Kerry in 2004, or maybe not quite, Trump, Clinton in 2016, but, it's on that level. And I think the part of that, right, which is funny because I think that Eisenhower has been so completely rehabilitated, by American progressives, that all, like, when he's brought up in these discussions at all, it's usually for the military-industrial complex speech.
Well, a big thing that progressives, I think, talk about with Eisenhower is the fact that he was kind of, I guess, cucked domestically by FDR and Truman. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he might have hated the New Deal policies, but he kind of had to keep them going and, like, couldn't really cut them. So I think a lot of times progressives use Eisenhower as an example of like, hey, look, like back then, like, progressives were so strong that even like the Republican that ran had to, assuage them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Because Eisenhower, and for that matter, Nixon, we're both operating within that kind of New Deal, later Great Society, consensus more or less.
Mm-hmm.
The same way, of course, that Clinton and Obama, were operating within the Reaganite consensus, when things flipped. But yeah, I think that the sort of part of the obviously, the more you know about Eisenhower, that's when the sort of really iconic United Fruit Company coups happened, in a place like Guatemala, the beginnings, of course, of American involvement in Vietnam. And
we love our bananas here, we can't get enough of them.
Well, the other thing about Roth, of course, is if you read American Pastoral. I've only read a couple of his books, but I read American Pastoral recently, which is a fantastic book.
I love American.
He really, radicalism is not. He's not a fan of radical. I mean, the upshot of the book is like, this is radicalism will eventually go in this direction. This, Weather Underground style.
I think that's right. Like, I think at his core, he's he's like a good New Deal liberal, but he's pretty suspicious of radicalism. I think it gets a somewhat more sympathetic take in another novel he wrote around the same time, I Married a Communist, which is his novel about McCarthyism. But certainly American Pastoral, which, I love that book. Like, that's my, if it's not my favorite Roth book, it's right up there. I mean, when I was, my wife and I were living in South Korea when we came back. We're getting ready to move back to the United States, and being a weird book hoarder, like I had to give up like tons of books because I couldn't didn't have room to pack all of them. So we ended up donating, you know, like a ton of, you know, mostly my books. Jennifer mostly reads Kindle, you know, to this expat bar that had like a take a book, leave a bookshelf on it. And so we had, you know, just before we left, you know, we had like the sort of giant piles of books to, you know, to take and leave. And I was trying to figure out what to leave. And I put my copy of American Pastoral on the leave pile, and like she actually took it out. She's like, "What's wrong with you? You love this book way too much to, you know, to leave it here. You know, you're clearly not leaving this." All right. So General Ripper commits suicide. Mandrake identifies Ripper's CRM code from his desk blotter and relays to the Pentagon. Using the code, Strategic Air Command successfully recalls all of the bombers except Major Kong's, whose radio equipment has been damaged in a missile attack.
I do just want to call attention to the process of him actually getting a hold of the president. That's also another one of my favorite parts of the movie is that the guy who comes in, his name is Colonel Guano. Again, another very subtle, punny name. And
that's not even a name.
Yeah, no.
Jack Guano is nobody's ever been named.
No. But just their whole exchange, him trying to get through on the payphone to the president and trying to get the change, and then he sends Guano's like, "Look, go shoot the Coke machine," and Guano replies like, "If you don't get through the president, you'll have to answer to the Coca-Cola Corporation."
Well, that's your whole foreign policy later.
Yeah, right.
Like, you might not mess with the president, but you're gonna have to answer to the Pepsi Corporation.
Well, that's also when I saw that scene, I thought it was sort of parallel to when the president says in the war room, "There's no fighting in the war room," or whatever.
Yeah. Yes, that's another of the best lines. God, it's so good. Never seen such a thing in the war room.
Yeah, right. Which, of course, a lot of what's going, like they're playing with in the movie is the idea that, you know, in this room where you'd make these world-ending decisions, you know, that that you know, you're supposed to display this certain decorum, and they're having fun with all the things that you know, destroy that decorum. Like, you know, like something that's kind of a throwaway thing, but, you know, it's one of the funnier, more memorable things in the movie is the General Turgison's you know, mistress calling him while he's in the war room, and he has to like talk her down, you know, for like, you know, getting mad or breaking up with him, and, you know, it's like, no, it's not just physical. No. So like, I deeply care about you. Someday we'll make you Mrs. Turgison.
Also, I guess there's a famous I guess moment when Reagan won and he's getting a tour of the White House. He famously asked, he was asked to go see the war room, and they were like, "There's no such, like, there's no war room, like that doesn't exist." And he was like, "Oh, well, in Dr. Strangelove there was a war room," and, you know, like, so I guess Reagan had believed that was like an actual thing up until the day he won the presidency.
Awesome.
That's very like Trump, like, show me the big boy toys of the White House.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with Trump, you know, it's like TV, things he saw on TV, or like, you know what I mean, like little bits of information. With Reagan, you know, there's like this weird dissonance of being a Hollywood actor and thinking Hollywood movies are real life, like in some cases. So like getting facts, like he picked up facts from movies that aren't necessarily true and just projected it into the world as if it was.
Yeah, well, I mean, famously, Reagan would actually would make claims in interviews and stuff that he had done things that he'd actually only been in movies doing, you know, which a lot of that, you know, was the Alzheimer's, I'm sure. Although also I think that it is really interesting, you know, because now we have all these, you know, like this like cliche of the Trump era that everybody says, oh, this is like this new dangerous, you know, post-truth world. And it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, like Reagan like made stuff up out of whole cloth just all the time, you know.
Yeah.
Like his speeches are full of specific examples of people he'd supposedly talked to who illustrated some right-wing talking point who never existed. You know, he just made them up, you know, on the fly.
And he was doing the George Costanza. It's like, it's not a lie if you believe it. Like, clearly Ronald Reagan believed. I don't know if Trump believes the shit he says or not, but Ronald Reagan clearly believed the bullshit he was saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think he did in general strokes, and then he just sort of fill in things to to make it cinematically better.
I mean, I feel like we're not living in a new time. We're just living in kind of a dumber time. Like, because there's a certain sophistication, I guess, to Reagan's stories in his mind were parables. You know what I mean? Like, it's like he's in the Bible and he's telling parables like Jesus did to people about like these right-wing talking points. It doesn't really matter if the person existed to him, because in his mind he's telling a story to illustrate a principle. With Trump, he just kind of said shit, and he was just like, like information would go in and out or whatever it was. Like, it just, it's not something new, but it's just dumber.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It sort of goes along with a nice tweet somebody sent me earlier today. There's the, since would respond to all of the things that have become really popular. And like, I feel like about the last year where people say, look at all these amazing things The Simpsons predicted. And they look at things that are old Simpsons jokes that have happened since then. And the line was that The Simpsons didn't predict shit. We just haven't solved any of the problems that existed in 1989 when The Simpsons started. Which is about right.
Hey, did you see the Proud Boys guy? I guess the guy that was in charge of it, like
Gavin McGinnis.
No, the at one point there was this guy that was like, I think he was Hispanic, that they were like pushing in front to be like, oh, we're not racist. See, like our leader, he was like Torrio or something. I guess he's been an FBI informant. Like, he had a long history as an FBI informant, and they talked to his lawyer, and his lawyer's like, yeah, like he solved like he put all these people away in like some big case with like tax evasion and fraud. I don't know. So it turns out that guy's been like an FBI plant the whole time.
That's really going to feed into the conspiracy mindset of those people. Like, geez.
Well, he was mysteriously not there the day of the Capitol raid, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
He's arrested. They arrested him at the first
which is, I should say, in the Patreon bonus episode for this week, I interviewed Daniel and Amberly Frost about their Jacobin article about QAnon. And that's one of the things we talked about a little bit, and they talked about in the article, because they've got this whole section in the article about what to do if you have loved ones who fall down the Q rabbit hole. Because a big problem is that if you try to argue with them all the time and tell them they're wrong, that you end up sort of reinforcing the idea that everybody's against them. You're a shill for the deep state. And of course, as they talked about, like, the worst thing that you could possibly do is what's sort of become popular in a couple of weeks since the Capitol riot, which is to report people to the FBI. Since if there's one thing that's going to convince them that they really are being persecuted by a conspiracy, be a visit from the FBI.
It also, I don't know, it's funny with our Goodfellas, Proud Boys thing with the Ray Liotta voice.
Oh yeah.
Just, I don't know, like, thinking about that guy being an informant, like, he's just sitting in court and he's like, it's them, they did, like.
Yeah, absolutely. All right,
Proud Boys in the court right now, like.
Yeah. All right, the Soviets attempt to find the bomber, but Kong has an attack a closer target due to dwindling fuel. As the plane approaches the new target, a Soviet ICBM site, the crew is unable to open the damaged bomb bay doors. Kong enters the bay and repairs the broken electrical wiring while sitting on the H-bomb, whereupon the doors open and the bomb is dropped. This is, of course, the, probably the most iconic image from the movie, the one that are pretty sure there was like a Simpsons, moment, making fun of this. In fact, this seems inevitable. There would be him riding the bomb down. And, which of course, leading up to that, there's been all the, there was all of the, going together with people who are higher up in the military in the movie, thinking that you could win, an atomic exchange with the Soviet Union, that there is something that it would mean to win that. There's a point where Kong actually tells the crew that when this is all over, they'll all get medals for their service in the nuclear war. But I guess at this point that's out the window, and we've acknowledged that no, we're just gonna die, and Kong actually becoming a suicide bomber, for the American military at the end of the movie is kind of the culmination of that. Back in the war room, Dr. Strange. That's right. Back in the war room, Dr. Strangelove recommends that the president gather several 100,000 people to live in deep underground mines where the radiation will not penetrate. He suggests a 10-to-1 female to male ratio for the breeding program to repopulate the earth once the radiation has subsided.
And again, Sellers' performance there is just that is just amazing. Just he's got that thing where he can't control his arm, and he's fighting it, and it's keeps doing the Sieg Heil thing. Mein Führer. I mean, Mr. President.
I guess one reason that he was in the wheelchair like throughout the movie, I mean, I think it was written, but like the reason that he was like wheelchair bound for the entire thing is he was supposed to play Major Kong, like, and he didn't want to, so he like feigned breaking his leg by falling off of the bomb when he was supposed to be riding down it because he didn't want to play that. Like, it almost wasn't Slim Pickens. He just didn't want to play a fourth role, so he like feigned breaking his leg according to like his wife at the time and his like family, and then showed up in a wheelchair, like, you know, for that last scene.
Yeah, which also probably tells you something about Stanley Kubrick if those are the links that he was going to go to you know,
Yeah.
he couldn't just say, nah, I don't really want to.
Yeah.
All right. Worried that the Soviets will do the same, Turgidson warns about a mineshaft gap, which
Another great line, mineshaft gap. Yes.
Well, Alexei secretly photographs the war room, which, yeah, actually, it's an interesting question. What he thinks that that's even going to do at this point.
Although you have to say, in defense of the Soviet ambassador, they just fucking dropped a nuclear bomb by accident on your country. So it's probably your duty as not just a Soviet citizen, but a decent human being who wants to avoid such things. Like, yes, take every fucking picture you can of the big board. You have to stop these people. They're fucking insane. Do whatever it takes. Grab whatever papers you can get on the way out because these Americans are fucking nuts.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Also, there's just a compulsiveness to it, like almost like, you know what I mean, and that happens with both the Americans and, you know, Alexei at the end, because it's almost like a compulsiveness to just keep one-upping each other the entire time, and that competitiveness at that point is like second nature to them. Like, it's almost like a moth to the flame. Like, they just have to do it.
I think that's right. Although I also think that Micah is right. You know, it's kind of like, you know, I've always thought, like, you know, if the like, you know, if the Rosenbergs were guilty, which I guess more recent information suggests they probably were, then we should probably have like a, you know, Rosenberg Day every year to celebrate the fact that they saved the world by doing this, you know, because if, you know, given that the United States had already dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that MacArthur wanted to in Korea, it seems like at that point it was just a matter of time, you know, if there was only one, you know, nuclear power, that, you know, that would have happened again.
Maybe the Rosenbergs, or at least
Julius.
Yeah, Julius, not his wife. Yeah. But maybe he prevented a scenario like we see in Doctor Strangelove.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the flip side is that it would have been much worse, you know, like the you know, because they both had it. But it also makes it, you know, much less likely, you know, which is, you know, that the, you know, mutually assured destruction, you know, despite the acronym, did work. You know, or I guess the more accurate thing to say is it has worked thus far.
Yeah, it's barely worked. I mean, you have all those close calls we were just talking about. Like, it by a fluke, it worked.
Right. Yeah, that's probably right. Like, I think probably if you had the Rick and Morty, you know, machine that you could hook up to your TV to, you know, to like look into the alternate timeline.
Oh, yeah. Like,
probably most of them don't have TV because most of them did not survive the Cold War.
Yeah, 999 out of 1,000 just don't exist.
One of the biggest reasons why we survived the Cold War is that the USSR was incredibly, like, you know, pulled back. Like, in pretty much every scenario that they could have, you know, done something, you know, first, or I don't know, they just. The Soviet Union, when you actually read the history of it, and when you actually read into, you know, what the premiers and, you know, what everybody was saying there were all these times where they could have struck first and they didn't, because they're just like, this is going to lead to all of us dying and it's just not worth it.
Right. Dave Weigel from the Washington Post quoted some anonymous House of Representatives member when Trump bombed Iran in early 2020, who said something like, in order to escalate to a gigantic shooting war between two powers, you need both sides to be pretty insane and stupid. And luckily, there's only one side that's insane and stupid in this case, and it is the United States of America. It is not Iran. And the same is true of a lot of different moments in the Cold War. I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, I think Iran probably, is is obviously a much smaller scale version, of the role that the Soviet Union was playing in the Cold War, which is to say that it's, interested to a certain extent and, throwing its weight around in the region. But that's a very different thing from having serious ambitions at having the kind of like global empire, that the U.S. does. Which, I mean, obviously, a very minor power like Iran is in no position to do, but like really the Soviet Union, like as much as without like understanding the brutality of a lot of what happened, in their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, it's also like that's also just a very different, like we're talking about this in the discussion with Daniel and Katie Halper and Ronnie Kolick on Monday, that like that's just a very different kind of ambition, that it's really about having like, using, like even when they were invading Hungary and all that stuff, like they were really like they just wanted that solid buffer, in Eastern Europe. After, like especially after the traumatic aftershock of the German invasion in World War II, as the sort of permanent defense. But there was very little, there's very little ambition that, that went beyond that. And I think really very little equivalent to the kind of debates that were going on in the US about whether the goal should even be to contain the Soviet Union or to just, annihilate it. But all right, Dr. Strangelove declares that he has a plan, but then rises from his wheelchair and announces, "Mein Führer, I can walk," as the Doomsday machine activates.
I can walk!
I guess
I've always loved just the horrible, like abhorrent futility of that line. Like him getting up and finally like taking 2 steps. Like it's just the darkest irony of like, it doesn't matter at that point. You know what I mean? Like the end is inevitable. And, for this almost miracle to happen of him, finally standing on these 2 feet, like, because the power courses through him and he finally stands up. But like, because they've destroyed the world, like having that moment of like extreme power doesn't matter.
Well, but that kind of destruction is the only thing that could get him to walk. That's the only thing that could, surge his body with the kind of spirit that was needed in order to make him get up out of his wheelchair. A side note, by the way, in normal times, I go to this movie series at the Music Box Theater in Chicago very often. That's put on by this like queer organization that does like acting out of scenes in the movie as the movie is going on. I think that is what these streams should turn into, with Ben reading the plot and then Forrest acting them out. I think that would make for really good viewing experience.
The more I do the more that I do this, the more comfortable I am kind of doing stuff like that. The first couple times I was way too nervous to like.
Well, you're nailing them. You got to keep it going, man. This is going to keep the viewers on the stream.
And I think it's also another example of the not very subtle innuendo, right? Just like he's talking about the 10 women to one man and the power and everything, and then he surges to attention, right? And then there's the big climax. Then boom, 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 right?
Well, it's the same with Slim Pickens riding down on pretty much a giant phallus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not at all subtle.
Fair enough. I'm actually wonder if we can get away with this without a copyright strike. Just play the 2-minute YouTube clip of the end of the movie.
Yeah,
I don't think you get a copyright strike because it's old enough.
Yeah. All right. Let's let's do it because
I also have that crazy New Yorker article that I wanted to look at for a second after, like at the end, because it goes through like how close a lot of the stuff actually was in happening.
Yeah, that was perfect.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I mean, an insane part of that is that each of those images, or like each bomb image or like video is probably a nuclear test. You know what I mean? Like, is that like there's now like a large area that's uninhabitable for a period of time because that bomb test happened.
Yeah. Yep.
Almost like we shouldn't have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I got from the movie.
Almost.
Well,
Except the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I got out of it was that they just probably needed to make a couple of technical adjustments to their security profile protocol to make sure this didn't happen.
That seems to be what the military took from it. I did also read that the military was motivated to make some changes to their system.
I have this article that talks about it.
Yeah.
That talks about some of the more insane. Some of the more insane. It's called "Almost Everything in Dr. Strangelove Was True." It's a New Yorker article. Yeah. So like one of the big things is at one point, the Air Force was really resistant to let any kind of like human any kind of human failsafe occur. Like to these weapons, and at one point they made they wanted a pin, so the person would have to put in a pin before they launched anything, and they made the pin 0000000. That was one of them, but I don't know exactly where it is in this. Like it's deep into it, but there's this story about how they were upset that they realized that one person, like in Dr. Strangelove, one person that wasn't the president and wasn't like a ranking member of the military could launch it. Like people, like they would have the code. And during the Kennedy administration, they kind of freaked out about that. So the military response was they from then on, two people would have the code, and each one would have half of the code, so that one person could never put in the full code. But with a bunch of people with guns and all kinds of weapons, and you know what I mean? Like, what could go wrong with that part of it if somebody really wanted to go psychotic?
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like, I mean, and it's really, I mean, we talk about like what counts as like too much power to to put in the hands of any given individual. And in terms of how political systems work, in terms of how economic systems work, but I mean, like you really can't get worse than that, right? That like having anybody, even the president, never mind, other people who are authorized to do this.
This is the quote that I was looking for. The early permissive action links were rudimentary. Placed in NATO weapons during the 1960s, known as Category A PALs. The switches relied on a split 4-digit code with 10,000 possible combinations. If the United States went to war, 2 people would be necessary to unlock a nuclear weapon, each of them provided with half the code. It was mainly useful to delay unauthorized use, to buy time after a weapon had been taken, or to thwart an individual psychotic hoping to cause a large explosion.
That's just insane that their security system is a 4-digit password. Like you can't even do that on Twitter now. Like that's considered too insecure. Like you need at least 12 digits.
First, it was a one person with an 8-digit code.
Yeah,
and they deny that it was 00000. But everybody that was involved in it, that this person interviewed, said no, that was the code that they gave us. Like,
awesome. All right, let's. I know Mike has another commitment. Let's let's wrap this up. So, any last thoughts about Dr. Strangelove from the panel?
Good movie.
Well, one thing we didn't really talk about that we would maybe need Danny to still be here to talk about is what I've heard some people argue before, which is that the movie really teed up the absurdity of Cold War America for the rest of the culture in a way that opened up space for us to finally be like, this is an absurd way to run our country and to live in the world with other people in it. And like, it was only, the way that could be accomplished, it couldn't be some solemn, grave movie about the horrors of nuclear war. It just like
Right.
had to take everything to this absurd degree with these absurd characters who very clearly are just sort of exaggerated forms of real trends in American life and in American politics. And yeah, it sort of teed it up so that then finally in the 60s there could be that kind of thawing period where we could say like this is absurd, we can't keep doing this.
Well,
Yeah.
the crazy thing is that Kubrick originally set out to make that grim, more serious, ultra realistic movie, and in the process realized that like he couldn't tell the story without making it satirical.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that today because I edited a review that we're publishing by Marianella Deprile and Jacobin about this new documentary about the organization 9 to 5, as well as the movie 9 to 5, starring Dolly Parton and Jane Fonda. And Jane Fonda initially set out to make a serious movie about the horrors of sexual harassment for women at work in the 80s. But then in engaging with these organizing efforts that women were doing through this organization 9 to 5, she realized, it'd be way better to just make an absurd, over-the-top comedy, which if anybody's ever seen 9 to 5, they know that the 9 to 5 it's sort of on the level of absurdity and over-the-topness of Dr. Strangelove in terms of how they conquer the boss. So that was just like, and again, that played this transformative role in the culture. And they talk in the documentary about how, like, obviously sexual harassment in the workplace isn't gone, but there was like a just turn on a dime shift in the culture after that movie was after it came out. And so this seems to be the best way to do it, to skewer these absurd reactionary lines of thinking and acting in American life.
Yeah, it would be great to have Daniel here for this, because one thing that keeps coming to my mind as we're talking about this is like, so I agree that like Strangelove does seem like this important cultural marker that led to a shift. On the other hand, like another of my favorite movies is War Games from the 80s, and it explores like the exact same issues, right? You have the exact same conflict, the military being worried that having humans in the decision loop can lead to not nuclear war, so we've got to make sure the machines are there to follow through, and then you get the same predictable outcome that the algorithm can't be trusted. Although in the end, it's the machine that learns the lesson. The only winning move is not to play.
Well, on that note, Wolf of Wall Street next week.
Yeah,
Sounds
I'm
good.
really excited for that. I love that movie.
Yeah.
I've never seen it, so I'm glad you're making me sit down for 3 hours or whatever it is to watch the whole thing.
Well,
Nice.
as you might imagine, it's like like Goodfellas. I think it's about the same length. That it goes very quickly.
It goes faster than Goodfellas, I'd say, because it's just so much like, I don't know, drug-addled Leonardo DiCaprio kind of just makes it feel really fast.
All right, guys.
All right.
See you next week.
Yep.
Best.